In the quiet suburbs of Perth, Australia, few could have imagined that behind the ordinary facade of a small house on Moorhouse Street lived two of the most ruthless serial killers in the nation's history. Catherine and David Burney were a seemingly normal couple, yet together they formed a deadly duo whose violent spree in 1986 left 4 women dead and an entire country horrified. This is the story of how their twisted relationship led to a chain of murders so brutal that it became etched in the annals of Australia's darkest crimes. David Burney and Catherine Harrison met as teenagers, bonding over their difficult childhoods. David, born in 1951, was one of 6 children raised in a dysfunctional family plagued by alcoholism, violence, and neglect. His early life was marked by crime, deviance, and cruelty to animals, indicators of the violent path he would later take. Catherine, born in 1951, also experienced a turbulent upbringing. After her mother's death, she was placed in foster care, leading to a deep sense of abandonment and loneliness. From the moment they met, Catherine and David formed a disturbingly close connection. Their relationship was toxic, with David often exercising control over Catherine, but it fed into both their dark desires. As young adults, they began committing petty crimes, but their partnership would soon escalate into something far more sinister. David's criminal behavior, which included theft, robbery, and sexual violence, landed him in prison multiple times. Each time he was released, he returned to Catherine, their bond deepening with each passing year. When they reunited in the mid-1980s, their shared fantasies of domination and violence took a terrifying turn. No longer satisfied with minor crimes, they decided to act on their most depraved impulses: kidnapping, rape, and murder. In October 1986, David and Catherine Burney embarked on a killing spree that would later be known as the Moorhouse Murders. Their victims were young women, chosen for their vulnerability. The first to fall into their trap was 22-year-old Mary Nielsen, a psychology student who had visited David's auto shop to buy some car parts. David and Catherine lured Mary to their home, promising her cheap car parts. Once inside, she was overpowered, bound, and gagged. Over the course of several hours, Mary was subjected to horrific acts of violence, including rape and torture. After fulfilling their sadistic desires, David strangled Mary with a nylon cord while Catherine watched. The Burneys then buried her body in a shallow grave in the forest. The murder of Mary Nielsen seemed to embolden the couple. They quickly moved on to their next victim, 15-year-old Susanna Candy, who was hitchhiking when the Burneys offered her a ride. Just like Mary, Susanna was taken to their house, where she was raped, tortured, and ultimately strangled by David, while Catherine forced the young girl to swallow sleeping pills. David later claimed that killing Susanna gave Catherine the thrill she needed to be a fully invested participant in their crimes. For Catherine, being with David was more than love. It was an all-consuming devotion. She was willing to do anything to please him, even if it meant becoming a murderer. Over the next few weeks, the Burneys killed 2 more women: 31-year-old Nolene Patterson, whom they held captive for 3 days before David killed her, and 21-year-old Denise Brown, whom they abducted from a bus stop. Each murder followed a sickeningly similar pattern. The women were lured into the Burneys' home, raped, tortured, and then murdered. David would strangle them, often with Catherine watching or helping in some capacity. Together, they would bury the bodies in remote areas outside of Perth. By November 1986, the Burneys had already killed 4 women, and they showed no signs of stopping. Their 5th intended victim, however, would ultimately be their undoing. On November 5th, they abducted 17-year-old Kate Moyer as she was hitchhiking. They followed the same routine, taking her to their house, binding her, and assaulting her. But Kate Moyer was different from the others. She was observant, resilient, and, most importantly, determined to survive. After enduring hours of abuse, Kate carefully watched her captors for an opportunity to escape. The next morning, when David left for work and Catherine was momentarily distracted, Kate saw her chance. She managed to untie herself, climb out of a window, and run for help. Kate ran through the streets, half naked and terrified, eventually reaching a nearby house where a kind stranger called the police. Her escape was nothing short of miraculous and marked the end of the Bernies' killing spree. When the police arrived at the Bernie home, they found evidence that confirmed Kate's story, along with items belonging to the previous victims. David and Catherine Bernie were immediately arrested. The trial of David and Catherine Bernie gripped the nation. As details of their horrific crimes emerged, the public was both appalled and fascinated. The Bernies confessed to the murders of Mary Nielsen, Susanna Candy, Nolene Patterson, and Denise Brown, though they showed little remorse for their actions. Their motive, as David explained, was simple. They enjoyed the thrill of killing. During the trial, Catherine's devotion to David was evident. She rarely spoke, allowing David to take control of the proceedings, just as he had taken control of their relationship. In many ways, Catherine was portrayed as both a victim and a perpetrator, someone who had been manipulated by David but who had also willingly participated in the murders. The prosecution, however, argued that Catherine was not an unwilling accomplice. She had actively assisted in the kidnappings, torture, and murders, and had even taken part in some of the rapes. The court heard how Catherine had encouraged David's sadistic behavior, and how she had derived pleasure from watching their victims suffer. In February 1987, David and Catherine Bernie were both found guilty of the murders and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Their crimes left a deep scar on the community, and the families of the victims were devastated by the loss of their loved ones. For many, the knowledge that such evil had existed in their own backyard was almost too much to bear. David and Catherine Bernie were separated after their conviction, with David being sent to maximum security Casuarina Prison and Catherine to Bandyup Women's Prison. In prison, David remained largely unrepentant, occasionally giving interviews where he spoke of his crimes with chilling detachment. He showed little remorse for the pain he had caused, and in one particularly unsettling interview, he claimed that he and Catherine had planned to kill even more women before they were caught. Catherine, on the other hand, struggled to adapt to life behind bars. Without David's influence, she became isolated and despondent. She often expressed regret for the crimes she had committed, though many questioned whether her remorse was genuine or simply an attempt to gain sympathy. Over the years, Catherine applied for parole multiple times, but each application was denied, with the parole board citing the extreme nature of her crimes. David Bernie's life came to a violent end in October 2005 when he was found dead in his cell, having hanged himself. His death brought a sense of closure for the families of the victims, though the scars of his actions would remain forever. Catherine Bernie, now in her 70s, remains incarcerated. She continues to serve her life sentence, and despite several attempts to gain early release, it is unlikely she will ever be freed. Her relationship with David Bernie, once a source of comfort and excitement, had led her down a path of destruction that she could never escape. The case of David and Catherine Bernie shocked not only Australia but the entire world. It was a stark reminder of how two seemingly ordinary individuals could be capable of such extraordinary evil. The Bernies' killing spree raised important questions about the nature of violence, the psychology of killers, and the dynamics of toxic relationships. Experts who studied the case pointed out the way David Bernie had used psychological manipulation to dominate and control Catherine, turning their relationship into a lethal partnership. Catherine, in turn, fed off David's cruelty, becoming complicit in his murderous fantasies. Together, they formed a deadly combination that allowed them to carry out their gruesome acts of violence. The murders also had a profound impact on the way hitchhiking was viewed in Australia. Before the Bernies, hitchhiking had been a relatively common practice, particularly among young people. However, after the murders, there was a sharp decline in the number of people willing to hitchhike, and parents became more cautious about their children accepting rides from strangers. The case led to widespread fear and paranoia, with many people no longer feeling safe in their own neighborhoods. In the years since the Bernie murders, true crime enthusiasts and researchers have continued to study the case, fascinated by the unique dynamics of the Bernie relationship and the psychology of their crimes. Numerous books, documentaries, and podcasts have explored the details of their killing spree, offering new insights into the minds of these cold-blooded killers. For the families of the victims, however, no amount of media attention can bring back their loved ones. The partnership between David and Catherine Bernie was not just a criminal conspiracy. It was a symbiotic relationship driven by a mutual thirst for control and sadism. Psychologists and criminologists who examined the case highlighted the unique dynamic between the two, where each fed off the other's darkest impulses. David, the more dominant and manipulative of the pair, was considered a classic example of a psychopathic personality. He exhibited a lack of empathy, a willingness to exploit others, and an unquenchable desire to control and harm. David's criminal history stretched back to his youth. He had engaged in acts of violence, cruelty to animals, and sexual assault long before his killing spree with Catherine. His behavior fit the pattern of an individual with antisocial personality disorder, a condition marked by a disregard for societal rules, laws, and the rights of others. His lack of remorse and emotional coldness were clear indications that his actions were not motivated by anger or revenge, but rather by a sadistic need to dominate and destroy. Catherine's role in their partnership was more complex. Some experts suggested she suffered from a form of dependent personality disorder, which made her more susceptible to David's influence. Her childhood had been marked by instability and abandonment, and when David re-entered her life in adulthood, she became emotionally and psychologically tethered to him. Catherine's entire sense of identity seemed to revolve around pleasing David, even at the expense of her own moral compass. Though Catherine was initially portrayed as a manipulated accomplice, it became evident during the trial that she was an active participant in the crimes. The chilling detail that Catherine had helped David subdue and assault their victims raised questions about her own sadistic tendencies. Psychologists proposed that her desire for approval from David, combined with her deep-seated insecurities, led her to suppress any sense of guilt or empathy. Instead, she embraced the violence, viewing it as a way to solidify her bond with David. The Bernies' crimes demonstrated how two individuals, when paired, can amplify each other's depravity. Separately, David and Catherine may have continued committing petty crimes or engaging in destructive behaviors, but together, they became something far more dangerous. The psychological dynamics of their relationship turned their private fantasies of control and violence into a deadly reality. While the Bernies have been the focus of much media attention and psychological analysis, it is essential to remember the lives lost during their killing spree. Each of the four victims, Mary Nielsen, Susanna Candy, Noeline Patterson, and Denise Brown, was a person with hopes, dreams, and loved ones. Their stories, cut short by the Bernies' cruelty, are a sobering reminder of the devastating impact of violence. Mary Nielsen, the Bernies' first victim, was a 22-year-old psychology student with a passion for understanding the human mind. She had her whole life ahead of her and had dreams of making a difference in the world. On the day she was abducted, Mary was simply looking to purchase car parts. Her encounter with David and Catherine would tragically be her last. Mary's death was particularly brutal, as she became the couple's first experiment in their twisted fantasies of torture and murder. The psychological trauma she endured in her final hours is a testament to the horror of the Bernies' sadistic acts. Susanna Candy, a 15-year-old schoolgirl, was abducted while hitchhiking. Unlike their first victim, Susanna's youth and innocence seemed to provide the Bernies with an even greater thrill. The fact that Catherine forced Susanna to take sleeping pills before David strangled her suggests the extent of their depravity. Susanna was described by friends and family as a kind-hearted and bright young girl with a promising future. Her life was stolen before she ever had the chance to fulfill her potential. Nolene Patterson, a 31-year-old flight attendant, became the Bernies' third victim. Her murder was particularly disturbing because the couple held her captive for 3 days, using her as a pawn in their power games. Nolene's family described her as a vibrant, adventurous woman who loved to travel and had a zest for life. The prolonged nature of her captivity and the torment she endured is a reminder of the extreme psychological and physical cruelty the Bernies inflicted on their victims. Denise Brown, a 21-year-old woman abducted at a bus stop, was the Bernies' final victim before their arrest. Denise's death followed the same horrific pattern as the others: abduction, assault, torture, and murder. Her story is one of lost potential and stolen dreams, as she, like the other victims, was denied the chance to live a full and happy life. Denise's family described her as a gentle and loving person who cared deeply about those around her. The families of the victims were left devastated by the murders, grappling with the sudden loss of their loved ones. The impact of these crimes rippled through the community, leaving behind a legacy of grief, fear, and unanswered questions. For the families, the Bernies' capture and sentencing provided some sense of closure, but the wounds caused by their crimes would never fully heal. The Bernies' killing spree sent shockwaves through the community in Perth. In a city that had previously been regarded as safe and peaceful, the murders shattered the sense of security that many residents had taken for granted. People who had once felt comfortable hitchhiking or walking alone at night now lived in fear that they could become the next victim. The brutality of the Bernies' crimes, combined with the randomness of their attacks, created an atmosphere of paranoia and anxiety. In the wake of the murders, local law enforcement faced criticism for failing to apprehend the Bernies sooner. Though their crimes occurred over a relatively short period of time, some believed that more could have been done to prevent the killings. The case sparked a broader conversation about police procedures, public safety, and the importance of community vigilance. As news of the murders spread across Australia, the media descended upon Perth, turning the Bernies into household names. The case became a national obsession, with newspapers and television stations providing extensive coverage of the investigation, trial, and aftermath. While some believed the media attention was necessary to raise awareness and ensure justice, others felt that it sensationalized the crimes and gave the Bernies an undue level of notoriety. The long-term effects of the murders on the community were profound. In addition to the grief experienced by the victims' families, many residents of Perth were left feeling violated and traumatized by the knowledge that such evil had existed in their midst. Schools and workplaces implemented new safety protocols, and hitchhiking, a once common practice, dropped dramatically in popularity. The Bernies' house on Moorhouse Street became a macabre landmark, with curious onlookers visiting the site to catch a glimpse of the place where the murders occurred. The house was eventually sold, and new occupants moved in, but the stigma surrounding the location remained. For years, locals spoke in hushed tones about the horrors that had taken place within its walls, and the street itself became a symbol of the darkness that had briefly engulfed the community. The case of David and Catherine Burney was one of the first in Australia to attract widespread media attention, and it marked the beginning of a new era in true crime reporting. The extensive coverage of the Burneys' crimes set a precedent for how the media would cover future cases of serial murder and violent crime. Television news programs and newspapers provided daily updates on the investigation, the trial, and the aftermath of the murders. The public was gripped by the details of the case, eager for every new revelation. This insatiable appetite for true crime stories helped to fuel the growing interest in the genre, which has since become a major cultural phenomenon. The media's portrayal of the Burneys as a Bonnie and Clyde type of couple, a pair of lovers turned criminals, added a layer of intrigue to the case. The narrative of a deadly romantic partnership, where love and violence intersected, captivated audiences and led to the widespread belief that the Burneys were not just killers, but figures of morbid fascination. However, the media's role in shaping public perception of the case was not without controversy. Some critics argued that the extensive coverage glorified the Burneys and detracted from the suffering of the victims and their families. By focusing on the psychological profiles of David and Catherine, the media risked turning them into anti-heroes rather than the monstrous figures they truly were. The case also highlighted the ethical dilemmas faced by journalists covering true crime stories. While the public has a right to know about crimes that affect their communities, the sensational nature of the coverage can sometimes lead to an imbalance in the narrative, with the perpetrators receiving more attention than the victims. In the years since the Burney case, journalists and true crime producers have had to grapple with how to tell these stories in a way that is both informative and respectful of those who have been harmed. The legacy of David and Catherine Burney's killing spree continues to haunt Australia to this day. Their crimes have left an indelible mark on the country's collective memory, serving as a grim reminder of the capacity for evil that exists within some individuals. For those who lived through the terror of the Moorhouse murders, the scars remain. The Burneys case has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and podcasts, each offering new insights into the psychology of the killers and the impact of their crimes. The fascination with true crime, which began in part with the extensive coverage of the Burney murders, has only grown in the decades since. Today, the genre has become a major force in popular culture, with countless films, television shows, and podcasts devoted to exploring the darkest corners of human behavior. While some may view the continued attention given to the Burneys as a form of morbid curiosity, others see it as an important way to remember the victims and to ensure that such crimes are never forgotten. The story of the Burneys serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of toxic relationships, the potential for manipulation and control, and the devastating consequences of unchecked violence. For the families of Mary Nielsen, Susanna Candy, Nolene Patterson, and Denise Brown, the pain of their loss endures. Though justice was served with the conviction of David and Catherine Burney, no amount of punishment can ever bring back their loved ones. Their stories, and the stories of all victims of violent crime, deserve to be told and remembered, not for the sake of sensationalism, but for the sake of justice and healing. As time goes on, the memory of the Burneys may fade, but the lessons learned from their crimes will continue to resonate. The case remains a dark chapter in Australia's history, a reminder that evil can lurk in even the most ordinary of places, and that the consequences of violence are always far-reaching and tragic. Top of form, bottom of form.